The Duke and the Dissenter. Chapter 1. The Summons. In the spring of 1841, the 7th Duke of Ashworth received a letter that would alter the course of his life forever, though he did not know it at the time. He sat in his study, a magnificent room lined with the leather-bound spines of his forefathers, the air thick with the scent of old paper and wood smoke. William Cavendish was not a cruel man, but he was a product of his station, 34 years old, possessed of a rigid sense of order and a deep, abiding suspicion of anything that disturbed the natural hierarchy of God, king, and peerage. The letter bore the heavy seal of the bishop's office. He read it once, then again, a faint crease forming between his brows. A dissenting preacher had established a meeting house in an old barn on the edge of his estate. Beyond his jurisdiction, technically, but close enough to draw the simple folk from the village. The bishop wanted it stopped. He wanted the Duke to stop it. "A nuisance," he murmured to his butler, a faithful servant named Fletcher who had been with the family for 30 years. "I am to go there, read the Riot Act if necessary, and arrest this prophetess. A woman, can you believe it? Preaching to mixed company. It's an affront to decency." Fletcher murmured something appropriately neutral. But even he had heard the whispers from the lower village. They spoke of a woman named Magdalen Cole, whose voice could make you feel the heat of hellfire and the cool breeze of redemption in the same sentence. They said she could read, and worse, that she was teaching others to do the same, men and women together, by candlelight. In a world where a man's place was dictated by his birth and a woman's by her husband, this was more than eccentricity. It was chaos. The following afternoon, the Duke ordered his horse saddled. He wore his authority like a cloak, the impeccably tailored greatcoat, the polished Hessian boots, his jaw set in a hard line. He declined Fletcher's offer to accompany him. "This is a legal formality, not a military campaign. I shall be back within the hour, and this Cole woman will be on her way to the magistrate." He rode off, a dark figure against the pale grey sky. He did not return within the hour. He did not return by supper. The candles in the hall were lit and then trimmed low, and still there was no sign of him. Fletcher stood by the window, his old bones telling him that the simple errand of the law had collided with something far more complex. When at last the sound of hooves crunched on the gravel drive, the clock had long since struck midnight. Fletcher opened the door himself. The Duke stood there, but it was not the same man who had left. His greatcoat was buttoned wrong. His cravat was undone and hanging limply. His hair, usually tamed with macassar oil, was wild, as if he had been running his hands through it constantly, but it was his eyes that truly arrested Fletcher. They held no trace of the satisfied magistrate. They were wide, bewildered, and bright with a strange, unnerving light. He walked past his butler without a word, not to the study for a brandy, but to the grand staircase. He paused with one hand on the newel post, his back turned. "Fletcher," he said, his voice hoarse, as if he had been shouting or debating. "The woman, she has a school, in the barn, 12 children. She was teaching them their letters when I arrived." He turned then and looked at his servant with an expression that had never before appeared on a Cavendish face. It was uncertainty. "I didn't arrest her," he said. And then, as if confessing a greater sin, "I stayed. We talked about the scripture, about faith, about everything." He climbed the stairs slowly, a man ascending to his own room as if in a dream. Fletcher stood in the hall for a long time, the silence of the great house pressing in on him. His master, a man who had never questioned the world as he found it, had met Magdalen Cole, and the world, Fletcher feared, had just tilted on its axis. Chapter 2. The Dissenter. The weeks that followed were a study in quiet torment. The Duke was not himself. He would emerge late for breakfast, his eyes shadowed, and push his food around his plate. He cancelled meetings with his land agent and ignored the post that piled up on his desk. Instead, He took to long, solitary walks. Fletcher knew where he was going. They all did. The servants' hall had a new, scandalous topic of conversation. The Duke was visiting the Dissenter. At first, Fletcher thought it was morbid curiosity, a man of his station slumming in intellectual novelty. But as the days passed, he saw it was something far more dangerous. The Duke was troubled. He would return from these walks and retreat to his study, not to read his estate books, but to pull down the great family Bible, a volume so heavy it required its own lectern. Fletcher would catch him in the library, surrounded by theological works that had likely not been touched since his grandfather's time, his brow furrowed in concentration. One evening, the Duke summoned him. He was standing by the fireplace, a glass of Madeira in his hand, though he had not drunk from it. "Fletcher," he began, his voice hesitant, "you are a man who reads. You have a practical wisdom. Tell me, what do you make of the Epistle of James? Faith without works is dead." Fletcher was startled. Theology was not the usual discourse between a butler and his master. He chose his words carefully. "It seems straightforward enough, Your Grace. That belief must be proved by action." "Precisely," the Duke said, a strange fervour in his voice. "Action, deeds. And yet the church of my fathers, the church I have defended, seems to me now a monument to stillness. We sit in our pews, we recite our prayers, we pay our tithes, and we call that faith. But where are the works? Where is the proof?" He began to pace. "She asked me, Fletcher, she asked me what I had ever done with my faith that cost me something. I have given money to the poor, yes. But I have never gone hungry. I have never been cold. I have never doubted my next meal. She and her followers, they have given up everything. They share what little they have. She sleeps on the dirt floor of that barn, not because she must, but because her followers do. That is the work she speaks of. It is a living, breathing faith. And I stood there in my fine coat and called it a disturbance of the peace." He laughed, a hollow, self-mocking sound. "I told her the world needed order, that the station of one's birth was God's will. She smiled at me, Fletcher, not a cruel smile, but a sad one. She said, 'Did God will the child born in the workhouse to ignorance, or did man? And if it is man's work, can it not be unmade by man?'" Fletcher saw then the source of his master's torment. She had not debated him on his own terms, but on higher ground. She had presented him with a mirror, and he did not like what he saw. He saw a man whose entire identity was built upon an accident of birth, not upon any act of merit or faith. He was a duke because his father was a duke. He was a Christian because it was the done thing. She was a preacher because she had been called, and a teacher because she believed it was her God-given duty. "She is dangerous, Your Grace," Fletcher found himself saying, not because he believed it, but because he had to say something. "Yes," the Duke agreed, stopping his pacing to stare into the fire. "She is. Not in the way the bishop thinks. She's not dangerous to the state. She's dangerous to me. She has made me see that my entire life has been a performance. I have been playing the role of a duke, playing the role of a Christian. But the play has stopped, Fletcher, and I am alone on an empty stage, with no idea who I truly am." It was a confession too raw, too personal for a servant to hear. Fletcher felt the weight of it like a physical thing. His master was not just questioning the sect, he was questioning the very foundations of his existence. And at the centre of this perfect storm of doubt was the calm, unshakable figure of Magdalen Cole. The inevitable summons came a fortnight later. It was not from the Duke, but for him. The bishop himself had arrived, unannounced, his black carriage a declaration of war. Fletcher showed him into the drawing-room, where the Duke waited, standing stiffly by the mantel. The bishop, a broad man with a face like a clenched fist, got straight to the point. "Your Grace, this has gone on long enough. Your association with this woman is a scandal. The magistrates are asking questions. I am asking questions. She is a heretic and a seditionist, and you are giving her legitimacy by your presence." The Duke's face was pale, but his voice was steady. "She teaches children to read, my Lord Bishop. She preaches the gospel. Where is the heresy in that?" The bishop's eyes narrowed. "She preaches without authority. She is a woman. She defies the order of creation, and her teachings on salvation by works alone, on a universal priesthood of believers that requires no ordained ministry, no church hierarchy, that is the very spirit of anarchy. It is a poison, and you are helping her to administer the cup." The two men stared at each other, a collision of two worlds. The political power of the church and the crumbling certainty of a man caught between duty and dawning truth. "You have your orders, Your Grace," the bishop said, his voice dropping to a cold finality. "This sect is to be dispersed. Its leader is to be arrested. If you cannot do it, I will find a man who can. But it will be done. Good day." He swept out, leaving a silence more deafening than his accusations. The Duke did not move for a long time. When he finally turned to Fletcher, his face was a mask of anguish. "Prepare the horse," he said. "I must go to her. I must warn her." Chapter 3. The Arrest. He did not go to warn her. Or perhaps he did, and the warning was too late, or she refused to heed it. Fletcher never learned the details of what passed between them that evening. The Duke returned late, more agitated than ever, and locked himself in his study. The next morning he emerged dressed not in his riding clothes, but in his formal black coat and white cravat, as if for a funeral. He was pale, but composed. "Fletcher," he said, his voice flat, "have the carriage prepared, and send word to the constable in the village. Tell him to meet me at the coal meeting house with 2 of his men." Fletcher's heart sank. Duty had won. The weight of his name, his position, his entire history had come crashing down upon him. He was going to do what he had been ordered to do. Fletcher felt a profound sense of disappointment, though he had no right to feel it. He nodded and went to do his bidding. He did not accompany the Duke to the barn. His place was in the house, but he has imagined the scene 1,000 times. He sees him standing before that rough-hewn door, the constables at his back. He sees him push it open and step inside. He imagines the smell of tallow candles and damp straw, the upturned faces of the poor, the bewildered, the hopeful. And at the far end, standing before a simple wooden lectern, he sees her, Magdalene Cole. Fletcher had only glimpsed her once, from a distance, but the image was seared into his memory. She was not young, perhaps in her early 40s, with a face that was more striking than beautiful. It was a face carved by experience and lit from within by an unwavering flame. Her hair was dark, streaked with grey, pulled back severely from her face. She wore a simple grey dress, indistinguishable from any farmer's wife. But when she stood to speak, she was transformed. She had a presence that filled any space she occupied. The Duke told him later what happened. The words came out in fragments over many nights as he sat by the fire, talking more to himself than to his servant. He said he walked in with the warrant in his hand, ready to read it, to end it. But she was in the middle of a lesson. She was teaching a group of adults, their faces grimy from the fields, their hands rough and calloused. She was teaching them to form the letters of their own names in a tray of sand. She looked up as he entered, and her eyes met his. She showed no fear, no surprise. It was as if she had been expecting him. "Your Grace," she said, her voice calm and clear. "Welcome. We are just learning to write. Perhaps you would like to see?" The constables shuffled their feet. The Duke stood frozen, the warrant crumpling in his grip. The law was in his hand, but she had offered him a different path. She had offered him a glimpse of her world, a world where a man's value was not in his title, but in the work of his hands and the letters he could form. He looked at the faces of the men and women, their eyes wide with desperate hope. He saw a young mother tracing a J in the sand for her child, John. He saw an old man, his back bent from a lifetime of labour, finally writing his own name for the first time. He saw the quiet miracle of it. And in that moment, he later confessed to Fletcher, he knew he could not do it. He could not be the one to extinguish this light. "Magdalen Cole," he said, but his voice was not the voice of an arresting officer. It was the voice of a broken man. "I have been sent. I am here to—" He could not finish. The silence in the barn was absolute. She waited, her gaze unwavering, full of a compassion that was more damning than any judgment. Then the door behind him burst open. The village constable, a man named Higgins, shoved past him, his face red with a zealot's fervour. He had not come for a quiet arrest. He had come for a spectacle. "In the name of the king," he bellowed, grabbing a young man by the collar. "This unlawful assembly is dissolved. You are all under arrest." Panic erupted. Women screamed, children cried, the constables waded in, pushing and shoving. The Duke shouted for them to stop, but his voice was lost in the chaos. He saw Magdalen Cole step from behind her lectern and move toward the fray, not to flee but to protect one of her flock who had been knocked to the ground. He saw Higgins grab her arm, roughly. He saw her wince in pain. And something inside the Duke snapped. It was not the Duke of Ashworth who acted then, but the man beneath the title. He strode forward, seized Higgins by the shoulder, and threw him back with a force that sent the constables sprawling into the dirt. "Unhand her!" he roared, his face contorted with a rage no one had ever seen in him. "I gave no order for this." He stood between Magdalen Cole and the constables, his fine black coat covered in dust, his cravat askew, his chest heaving. He was a duke defending a heretic. He was an officer of the law defying his own men. He was a man, finally, fully alive. In the stunned silence that followed, Magdalen Cole's voice was the only sound. "Thank you, William," she said simply. She had used his Christian name, and he had not flinched. Chapter 4. The Reckoning. The Duke did not bring Magdalen Cole to the magistrate that day. He escorted her and her followers out of the barn himself, placing his own body between them and the constables. He then dismissed Higgins on the spot, an act of authority he still possessed, though its moral foundation had crumbled. He rode back to Ashworth Park, not with a prisoner, but with a chaos of thoughts that would take years to order. The aftermath was swift and brutal. The bishop made good on his threat. He went above the Duke's head, to the Home Office itself. A duke defying the church was one thing. A duke aiding and abetting a known dissenter was a matter of state. Letters were written, visits were paid. The weight of the establishment, the very world the Duke had been born to inherit and uphold, turned against him. He was summoned to London. He was not received at court. His friends, his fellow peers, looked through him at his club. He was a pariah, a traitor to his class. They did not understand that he had not betrayed them. He had simply stopped believing in the lie. During those dark months, he told Fletcher everything. He would sit in his study, the fire his only companion, and unburden himself to the only soul in the house who would listen without judgment. "She asked me once, Fletcher, what I would be if I were not a duke," he said one night, staring into the flames. "I had no answer. I am a duke, like a fish is wet. It is not what I do, it is what I am. But she is Magdalen Cole. If you took away her preaching, her followers, her mission, she would still be Magdalen Cole. Her faith, herself, it is all internal. It cannot be taken away. Mine was all external. It was a coat I wore, and now that it's been stripped from me, I am cold." He paused, and a ghost of a smile touched his lips. "She has been arrested, you know. They did it quietly, a month ago. She is in the county jail awaiting trial for sedition. They will transport her, most likely, to Australia." The news hit Fletcher like a physical blow. "I am sorry, Your Grace," was all he could manage. "I have been to see her," the Duke continued, his voice dropping to a whisper. "In that terrible place. She was radiant, Fletcher. Can you believe it? In chains, in a cell, she was more at peace than I have ever been in this palace. She is still teaching. She has taught 3 of the other women in her cell to read their Bibles. She is converting the jailers with her kindness." He turned to his servant then, and his eyes were wet. "She told me not to be sad. She said that her work would continue, with or without her. She said that an idea cannot be transported. And then she said something else. She said she loved me. Not as a duke, not as her protector, but as the man who had questioned, who had doubted, who had finally chosen her over his own world." He buried his face in his hands, and I could not say it back. I felt it. God knows I felt it. But the words, they are not in my language. I have spent my whole life speaking in titles and commands and pleasantries. I have no words for what I feel. She taught me to doubt my faith, to question my world, but she could not teach me how to love. That lesson I must learn on my own. The trial was a formality. She was found guilty and sentenced to 14 years transportation. The Duke used what little influence he had left to ensure she would be treated as well as possible on the voyage. It was a pitiful consolation. On the morning her ship was to sail, the Duke stood on the cliffs overlooking the channel, a small, solitary figure against the vast grey sky. Fletcher stood a respectful distance behind him. He held a letter in his hand, one that had been smuggled out to him from her cell. He read it aloud, his voice breaking on some of the words. "My dear William, do not think of this as an ending. A seed must fall into the ground and die before it can bear fruit. Perhaps I was that seed in England. Perhaps I will bloom in another soil. You ask what you should do. You ask me to give you a purpose, a work. But you already have it. Your work is to stay, to remain in the world you were born to, not as its unquestioning son, but as its living question. Be the doubt in their certainty, William. Be the voice that asks, is this just? Is this true? Is this loving? That is the school I leave to you. That is your flock. Teach them by your life that a man's worth is not in his title, but in the size of his questions. I will think of you, always, under the Southern Cross. Yours, in faith and hope, M." The Duke folded the letter carefully and placed it over his heart. He stood for a long time, watching the distant sails on the horizon. He did not weep. He was beyond tears. He turned away from the sea and walked back towards his servant. He was still the Duke of Ashworth. He would return to his great house, to his duties, to his lonely meals in the cavernous dining room. But he would not be the same man. As he passed Fletcher, he paused. "Fletcher," he said, his voice quiet but firm, "I want you to find out which of the village children cannot read. Make a list, discreetly. We will begin with a small school, in the old gamekeeper's cottage. It will be our secret." Fletcher nodded, his own throat tight. He watched him walk away, the Duke who had gone to arrest a heretic and stayed to have his soul dismantled and rebuilt. He was a man caught between 2 worlds, belonging fully to neither. He was a duke without a country, a Christian without a church, a man who had found his heart only to have it sail away. And so the story ends where it began, in the great hall of Ashworth Park, with a duke changed by a woman he could not have. The house is quieter now, but it is not empty. It is filled with the echo of questions. And sometimes, on a clear night, the villagers see him on the cliffs, a solitary figure, watching the stars and wondering which one shines down